Alright then, let's begin by getting oriented in the Republic. We are now starting submodule 2.3 on the division of labor. In this submodule, we'll look at parts 2, 3, and 4 of the Republic, circled here in red in the bookmarks of our text on Brightspace. We'll begin with part 2, which is the subject of the present lecture 2.3.1, the model state. In the three sections of part 2, Socrates draws up a preliminary sketch of a utopian society and notably discusses the principle on which that society is founded, the principle of the division of labor, that gives our submodule 2.3 its name. Part 3, which is the subject of our next lecture, addresses the education of the guardians. We'll look specifically at Part 3, Section 1a and 1b on the theological and moral education of the guardians. In Part 4, which is the subject of our last lecture in submodule 2.3, Plato makes a crucial distinction between what Socrates had up until this point called the guardians quite generally, and a special class of guardians in the truest sense. From now on, it's only the latter that he'll actually call guardians or rulers. The others he calls auxiliaries or soldiers. This is a crucial distinction without which we'd never be able to circle back to our original quest for a definition of justice. And Part 4 is dedicated to spelling out the relations between those two classes, as well as all the farmers, builders, weavers, business people, and bankers that were introduced in Part 2. Alright, so let's get going. Our lecture on Republic Part 2, Sections 1 to 3, is organized into 5 segments. We start with 1, the pivot to society, in which we learn, among other things, why the Republic is called the Republic. We'll then look at some methodological precursors and preconditions to Socrates' discussion. These methodological considerations lead straight into section 1 of part 2, in which Socrates discusses his first state and discovers the principle of the division of labor. That's followed by a discussion of section 2 of part 2, in which Socrates presents his civilized society, or second state, and encounters a considerable complication. That complication becomes a full-blown major problem for Socrates around the dinner table, and even more so for Plato in the construction of his book. We'll address this by turning to section 3 and its consideration of the qualities of the guardians. 1. Pivot to society. Glaucon and Adeimantus' cleaning up and systematizing of Thrasymachus' original objections to Socrates presents a significant challenge to the idea that justice is natural and real, as opposed to conventional and made up. In taking up the challenge, Socrates begins by glazing the challengers, quoting a poem about them. Sons of Ariston, pair divine, sprung from a famous sire. Socrates observes that you must indeed have something divine about you if you can put the case for injustice so strongly. Remember that Glaucon and Adeimantus are our author Plato's real-life brothers? Ariston is Plato's dad. Unless something has changed materially about sibling rivalry over the centuries, I cannot help but think that Plato is writing this a bit tongue-in-cheek. Pair divine. Turning away from family dynamics and toward the philosophy of it all, note that Socrates calls Glaucon and Adeimantus' argument the case for injustice. They, of course, were making a case for justice, as convention. So Socrates is here measuring their case by the independent standard mentioned in previous lectures. By that standard, justice as some conventional agreement is actually not justice at all, or injustice. Not unlike Kant's view of morality in the groundwork, Socrates believes that we all already intuitively know what justice is. Socrates also does not believe that the brothers actually believe in their case for quote-unquote justice. He thinks they're playing devil's advocate, and he notes that they're doing it well. So well, in fact, that at first he plays coy and says he can't compete with a pair divine. But they keep asking, and convinced to go on, Socrates now starts his response to Glaucon and Adeimantus' challenge to the nature and utility of justice. Glaucon and the rest of them begged me to proceed and not let the argument drop, but try to find out what justice and injustice are and what is their real usefulness. That is to say, Socrates sets out to find what kind of a good thing justice is, as well as what, if anything, justice is good for. In what comes next, Socrates takes his cue from Glaucon's account back in Part 1, Section 4, when Glaucon locates the origin of justice in an idealized founding moment where some mythical group of people, a they, proceeds to make laws and mutual agreements. Socrates seems to say, let's imagine this founding moment a little bit more fully and see whether justice is really as conventional or man-made or artificial as you say it is. And out pops the Republic. So, speaking of this founding moment, in Part 2, Sections 1 to 3 of the Republic, Plato has Socrates quite literally found an imaginary, idealized society, a utopia. But this utopia is not merely pie in the sky, it is to provide us with a theoretical model to understand what justice in a society, and by extension, justice at large, may look like. And that's why the present lecture is called The Model State. And the rest of the Republic is in many ways simply an elaboration of what goes into the making of that model society. At the beginning of Part 2 of the Republic, we are, then, witnessing a major pivot in the book. Not only is Socrates now firmly in the hot seat, as opposed to his interlocutors, who were giving us their half-baked theories until now, but we are, for the first time, getting a sense why the book is called The Republic. We'll see, moreover, that there is an all-important foundational principle Socrates comes across right at the start of Part 2, and that will be present in almost all later developments, the principle of the division of labor. That's why the present submodule of Module 2 is called the division of labor. Socrates starts this pivot to society by noting, justice can be a characteristic of an individual or of a community, can it not? Now, the Republic started in Part 1 with a discussion of what makes a person a just person by looking at different kinds of personal behavior. This didn't get us very far and instead led straight to Thrasymachus' cynical case for bad behaved rulers or authoritarianism. But authoritarianism is, of course, a form of social arrangement or government. This was the first intimation that there's a connection between justice and injustice and good and bad governance. Socrates' response to Thrasymachus, imagining an element of justice in the cooperation even among a gang of thieves, further suggested that there's a relation between justice and injustice and group dynamics. Finally, Glaucon's discussion of mutually beneficial lawmaking sealed the deal that a discussion of justice must somehow consider social arrangements. 2. Methodology. Socrates now makes 3 methodological points. First, noting that the subject of justice is obscure, he makes the somewhat odd observation that the thing we're looking for, justice, would be easier to see in the larger entity, and a community is larger than an individual. And he concludes that we should begin to look for it there. I accordingly propose that we start our inquiry with the community and then proceed to the individual and see if we can find in the smaller entity anything corresponding to what we have found in the larger. This may sound weird and simplistic at first, but I do think Socrates has a point. The relative justice or injustice of an individual's actions is indeed hard to discern, especially if they are adept at seeming but not being just, along the lines Glaucon and Adeimantus discussed. But injustice at a societal scale can hardly remain hidden for long. Second, Socrates says, come then, let us proceed with our imaginary sketch of the origin of the state. The methodological point here is that this is a thought experiment. We're not doing comparative politics or an empirical survey of different forms of actually existing governments in the region. Later in part 5, looking back on the earlier discussion, Socrates reinforces the point. We set about founding an ideal state. As noted earlier, that's why the present lecture is called the model state. That's my language, of course, but the idea is that Socrates is modeling an ideal societal organization in order to see if a well-founded state is, as one might expect, also a just state, and what, if anything, that justice consists in. The fruits of that modeling labor will have to wait until part 5, where Socrates will finally discuss justice in the larger entity and justice in the smaller entity. This is the topic of our course module 2.4. Third, the thought experiment concerns specifically the founding or the origin and early development of such an ideal or utopian society, a community coming into existence. The idea behind this is that the founding moment will throw the founding principle or principles into sharper relief, including, if our ideal society is a just society, the principle or principles that make it so. We might be able to see how justice and injustice originate in it. That's not a bad plan, and as we will see in a moment in section 3, it is indeed how the founding principle of our ideal society, the principle of the division of labor, is discovered. But contrary to the procedure envisioned here, this does not immediately lead to the discovery of our ideal society's principle of justice. For that to be discovered, the methodological simplicity of looking only at the founding moment must be abandoned. Initially, this only happens over Socrates' objections. I can't help but think that this is Plato saying, however much the old man liked the simple life, things must get a little more complicated before justice comes out of hiding. So let's recapitulate. The first methodological point is simply the pivot to society. We're looking for justice not in the individual, but in the larger social arrangement. The second methodological point is that this is done in the form of a thought experiment, not an actual social or political empirical kind of research. The third methodological point is that we're looking specifically at the origins of such a idealized society. 3. Section 1. First state and division of labor. Right at the outset of our modeling exercise, Socrates notes the natural connection between individual and society. Society originates then, so far as I can see, because the individual is not self-sufficient. Society then springs, as we have seen, from our needs. Our needs are not made up or artificial or matters of convention. Our needs are entirely real or natural. According to Socrates, our first and greatest need is the provision of food. Now, you may ask, what about water? What about oxygen? What about sleep? Aren't those needs as well? Well, yes, but there is an important difference. Socrates speaks of needs with respect to which the individual is not self-sufficient. With respect to breathing, for example, we are self-sufficient. Okay, yes, we do need oxygen in the environment in order to survive. We don't produce it ourselves, and in that sense we are not self-sufficient even with respect to air. But assuming there is breathable air in the environment, we're good to go breathing-wise. We don't need anyone else for it. Same with water and sleep and other matters related to bodily functions. Food is different because it is, as we will see, a need the satisfaction of which is more labor intensive and, in that sense, societally sensitive. And if you read closely, as we always must in philosophy, and as is typically rewarded when you read a great philosopher like Plato, you can see this right here in the text. Because Plato does not actually say that food is our need, he says it's the provision of food that we're not self-sufficient for. The process of getting it. All right then, continuing with our labor-intensive needs, our second need is shelter. And finally, clothing of various kinds, including, as we'll see, shoes. Those needs are existential. You can't long survive or survive and thrive unless they are met. And though it's hard to see at this point, basing everything that follows on these natural and so non-conventional conditions of survival will be critical to the non-conventional nature of justice Socrates will argue for in Part 5. This then immediately raises the question, how will our state supply these needs? And the answer is that they are satisfied by us, by actions we ourselves undertake, namely by producing the things that satisfy those needs. In short, by work, labor. Let's stick to the four occupations Socrates mentions. The farmer, who supplies our food needs. The builder, who satisfies our need for shelter. The weaver, who provides the cloth to clothe us. And the shoemaker, because somebody has to provide the Air Jordans. In all these medieval renditions of the professions Socrates invokes in the Republic, the one thing that strikes me is how focused and intent on their work the people working are. With multiple needs and the consequent need for multiple forms of labor, the immediate next question is, what's the best way to get the job done? And there seems to be two basic options, which we might call individualism and collectivism. Collectivism is the idea that we divide the socially necessary labor among ourselves, pool the products in a common stock, and then divvy them up according to our needs. So collectivism calls for the division of labor. The logical alternative is to not do that and instead have everyone provide everything for themselves. Should he, in other words, avoid the trouble of sharing with others and devote himself to providing for his own needs only? Such rugged individualism would call for aggregating all the socially necessary labor in each individual. If these are the two options, then how should we proceed in the founding of our state? Adeimantus helps make the decision between the two options. The first alternative, in other words, collectivism, is perhaps the simpler. And this establishes the principle of the division of labor as the founding principle not only of the current effort of devising a model state, but, as we will see, as the underlying theoretical principle for the entire republic. Adeimantus' initial reason for picking this principle is the somewhat tentative idea that it seems simpler. But simplicity isn't really very precise. After all, rugged individualism is also pretty simple and arguably simpler than dealing with your neighbors and divvying things up fairly. But perhaps Adeimantus has something more like, it'll make our lives simpler, in mind. After all, rugged individualism is, well, rugged, which is to say it may be logistically simple. After all, it's just you and you don't have to coordinate with anyone. You avoid, as Socrates says, the trouble of sharing, but doing it all by yourself is certainly not simple in the sense of easy. It's hard. Socrates pursues exactly that line by focusing on naturalness and efficiency. Proceeding by way of the division of labor is both natural and efficient. First, then, the principle is grounded in the natural diversity of people and their aptitudes. In the first place, no two of us are born exactly alike. We have different aptitudes which fit us for different jobs. This is not unlike Charles Darwin's grounding of the principle of natural selection in the natural variability of individuals within a given species. But I digress. This natural grounding of the principle of the division of labor is important because Plato will subsequently ground justice and morality on that principle, and the natural grounding of the principle of the division of labor thus ultimately accounts for the naturalness of justice and morality itself, which is just what he needs to argue against Glaucon and Adeimantus' position that justice is a matter of convention. Second, Socrates gives the principle a pragmatic grounding in the efficiency of production that results from following the principle of the division of labor. This, in turn, has two dimensions, a qualitative and a quantitative dimension. The naturally suited worker is able to first produce higher quality products, and second, produce them faster than a not naturally suited worker. This too is to some extent natural. While it's not natural in the way a natural or inborn aptitude might be, it is a principle that somehow resides in the nature of things. When you're good at something, you do it with efficiency and grace. And if you're looking for Plato's official statement of the principle of the division of labor, this is, in fact, it. Once again, quantity and quality are therefore more easily produced when a man specializes appropriately on a single job for which he is naturally fitted. Later on, in Part 2, Section 2, Socrates also calls it the principle on which we all agreed when we started constructing our state, that one man could not do more than one job or profession well. And again, later in Part 3, he calls it simply the principle that one man does one job well. And finally, in Part 5, that in our state, one man was to do one job. It is, in short, the one man, one job principle. I'd only suggest, consistent with Plato's explicit application of this principle to women in Part 6 of the Republic, on women and the family, and so consistent with the consequent equality of the sexes that follows, since frequently women will be the people best fitted for the job, even for traditionally male-coded jobs like soldiering. I suggest, in short, that we drop man and swap it for person. I'm sure Simone would agree. So it's the one person, one job principle. An implication of the principle of the division of labor is that each worker must produce more than they can themselves consume. So we must produce at home not only enough for our own needs. This is the idea of a surplus production, which is, in the first place, the production of a surplus. After all, the division of the process of labor entails the subsequent division of the products of labor. And in order to divide the products of our labor, there has to be enough to divide. Now, the division of the products of labor takes the form of exchange. I contribute the product of my labor in exchange for yours. The increase in quantity and quality of the products of labor is key to this exchange. The more high-quality products I can produce in a short period of time, the better I'll be positioned to exchange my products for high-quality products of yours, both in foreign and domestic markets. Now, the production of a surplus, as a result of gains in efficiency due to the division of labor, also leads to a surplus of production, or to an increase in productive activity overall. All of this then naturally leads both to economic growth and growth in population. The principle of the division of labor and the mutual exchange of the products of that divided labor both come to the same thing. That's why Socrates can now say about our state that such mutual exchange was the reason for our state's foundation. When, of course, the founding principle was the principle of the division of labor. They are two sides of the same coin. But how then does that exchange work? How are our citizens to exchange the products of their labor? It turns out that mutual exchange is not simply a potluck or gift exchange or giveaway. Instead, the mutual exchange of the products of the divided labor takes the form of trade, and trade in turn entails something new. They will buy and sell. As a consequence of the trade in surplus products, the products of labor become commodities, no longer just useful for whatever they're useful for, but also useful for trade. This is the distinction between a thing's use value and its exchange value. These relations were explored by 18th and 19th century economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. The exchange of commodities, namely of objects possessed not only of use value but of exchange value, leads to the formation of a new kind of object, money. Here's how Marx puts the same point. The historical broadening and deepening of the phenomenon of exchange develops the opposition between use value and exchange value, which is latent in the nature of the commodity. The need to give an external expression to this opposition for the purposes of commercial intercourse produces the drive toward an independent form of value, which, namely that drive, finds neither rest nor peace until an independent form has been achieved by the differentiation of commodities into commodities and money. So, with the advent of a currency, our model state now contains not just the original farmers, builders, weavers, and shoemakers, plus retailers, seafarers, and manual laborers, but crucially, bankers to manage the budding market economy. And with that, it seems to Socrates that our model is complete. So, where's the justice? Where are we to find justice and injustice in it? Adeimantus drops the crucial hint. It might lie in some relationship between the elements we have examined. So, following our original three methodological principles according to which we're conducting a thought experiment about the origins of a well-formed society, now it's a matter of reading off the social relations in which justice may manifest. 4. Section 2. Second state. Living it up. But the moment they look at social relations among the citizens of the first state, Glaucon butts in and complains about the society that's been presented so far. Really, Socrates? You might be catering for a community of pigs. The first state was very simplistic, and while Socrates seems to like it quite a bit and seems not entirely happy to leave it behind, as we'll see below, Glaucon isn't as easily satisfied. So Socrates says, all right, I understand. We are to study not only the origins of society, but also society when it enjoys the luxuries of civilization. Socrates' slight reticence here is a reminder of the third methodological principle noted above, in segment 2, that he was at first only concerned with finding the original principle of social organization, not with engaging in further thought experimental nation building. Note once again that if he did not at this point let himself be persuaded to go beyond the first state, then, looking ahead a bit, auxiliaries, guardians, three parts of the soul, and in the end justice wouldn't be found. Once again I speculate, but I think Plato here provides a subtle philosophical critique of what may have been the historical Socrates' instinct to stick with bucolic simplicity and rugged social health. Those are nice things to have, but they don't get you very far, either societally or philosophically. For though the society we have described seems to me to be the true norm, just as a man in health is the norm, there's nothing to prevent us, if you wish, studying one whose temperature luxury has raised. Such a society will not be satisfied with the standard of living we have described. Here's Socrates holding up the first state as the healthy, normal state, and anything beyond that as somehow feverish, whose temperature luxury has raised, unhealthy, and corrupt. In these images of health and sickness, we see a possible tension with the subsequent idea of justice as natural consequence of a healthy and harmonious state and soul. The application of the principle of the division of labor at the intra-societal level up to a certain degree of mercantile diversification is seen as healthy, but beyond that degree it's seen as corrupt. The tension is that in the subsequent fully formed state, abiding by the principle of the division of labor is then seen as healthy again. Regardless, Socrates agrees that a more sophisticated or more civilized society will want chairs and tables and other furniture, and a variety of delicacies, scents, cosmetics, sweets, and mistresses. And thus we go from hard-working farmers to debauchery and corruption. Now, especially in an agrarian society where productivity is constrained by the available land, the need for expansion is the necessary price we pay for economic growth. And this means that something darker than mere debauchery is on the horizon. If we are to have enough for pasture and plough, we shall have to cut off a slice of our neighbor's territory. This means territorial expansion beyond what's actually your territory. As you may have guessed, the neighbors won't like that. What's more, the expansive drive will be mutual and mutually exclusive. And if they too are no longer confining themselves to necessities and have embarked on the pursuit of unlimited material possessions, they'll want a slice of ours too. And that will lead to war, Glaucon. Will it not? Damn right it will. But it means a considerable addition to our state, the addition of an army, which will go out and fight for its interests and defend its citizens against all comers. It means the addition of state-sanctioned violence, professionally managed by an army. The addition is indeed considerable because, as we'll soon see, it changes the very structure of our budding society. Here we see that the principle of the division of labor, which originally emerged from rational deliberation about how to best satisfy our natural needs, now becomes a decision-guiding principle. If the question is, how do we proceed in building our state? The answer now must be, consult the principle of the division of labor. And that principle now tells us that in a well-formed and well-founded society, farmers cannot be soldiers. But can't the citizens fight for themselves? Not if the principle on which we all, yourself included, agreed when we started constituting our state is sound. And that was, if you remember, that one man could not do more than one job or profession well. Right from the start of the discussion of the requisite qualities of the soldiers, it becomes clear that the tone of the conversation has shifted because defining the job of the soldier presents unique difficulties. We are not simply adding a new group of skilled laborer to our model state, which would be a merely quantitative change. It's no longer find the person with the green thumb and you got your farmer. Instead, choosing men with suitable aptitudes for the defense of our state is no mean task to undertake. It's no mean feat. Now, we have to be very clear here. As difficult as it may be in the real world to find a qualified workforce, just listen to the ads on the radio, the difficulty Socrates is talking about here is entirely a theoretical one. We're not recruiting actual soldiers, after all. We're imagining what the right kinds of qualifications for and qualities of our soldiers would have to be. And that, as it turns out, is tricky. Previously, adding new professions was easy, guided by an identification of our needs and who'd be best positioned to satisfy them. By contrast, defining the job of the soldier is no mean task in the first place because, as we'll see in a moment, soldiers will have to have a set of seemingly mutually incompatible qualities. It is no mean task in the second place because nurturing those qualities will change our society in previously unimagined ways by layering it, which is to say, by introducing levels to it, and hence by introducing not merely new kinds of job, but different kinds of people or classes, thereby making our second state not only quantitatively, but qualitatively different from the first agrarian state. Defining the job of the soldiers is no mean task in the third place because of the consequence this layering of society has for the principle of the division of labor itself. It casts the principle in a new and different light. For once we have defined what the job of the soldier is, the principle now no longer simply tells us how to divide the available labor within a given level of society. It no longer has a merely intra-societal level application, where the definition of intra is within, as in intravenous injection, for an injection that goes right into or inside or within the vein. Intramural sports, for sports competitions within the same school. Or intracranial occurrences, for events within your skull, such as the learning that is happening there right now. No, the principle of the division of labor now also tells us how to divide the labor between the different classes of society. So it now has an inter-societal level application, where the definition of inter is between, as in interstate highway, or a highway that runs between states, or international relations, as the relation among or between nations, or intergalactic empire, Wakanda forever. This is important because it is because of this inter-societal level application that the principle first becomes relevant for the discovery of justice. And that, of course, is what the investigation is all about. That's why Plato couldn't just stop at Socrates' romantic idea of a bucolic, communal, agrarian state, because in the final analysis, in part 5, justice has not so much to do with the relations between different professions within a given level of society, but with the relations between different levels of society. And in the communal agrarian state, there was only one level. 5. Section 3. Qualities of the guardians. Socrates' discussion of the qualities of the soldiers guarding our society begins with an analogy between such human guardians and guard dogs. There is, I said, a certain similarity between the qualities needed in a good watchdog and those needed in our guardians. This seems straightforward and innocuous enough, but it is a strategic analogy, as we will see, because it soon gets Socrates out of a pickle he didn't anticipate. Continuing the analogy, Socrates focuses on both the guard animal's physical and mental attributes. The physical attributes are strength as well as keen perception and speed. The mental attributes are courage and, as a precondition for that, mettle and spirit. We will soon see that this element of spirit is an important dimension of Socrates' conception of human psychology. For now, though, it creates a problem because mettle and spirit translates into a willingness and even eagerness to fight, a slightly unhinged, trigger-happy aggressiveness. The problem is that if the guardians are overly aggressive, they'll be aggressive in their behavior to each other as well, not to mention in their behavior to the rest of the community, which they are supposed to protect. And that means they wouldn't be good guardians. As good guardians, they ought to be gentle toward their fellow citizens and dangerous only to their enemies. But how can such a toxic stew of fellow feeling and viciousness be managed? How do we make sure they're super dangerous but only to their and our enemies? At first, it seems like these seemingly inconsistent qualities make guardians an impossibility. We seem to be asking the impossible, and if so, a good guardian is an impossibility. Now, this threatened impossibility of the guardians constitutes a real problem for Socrates. If a good guardian is an impossibility, then our effort to design a model state based on the principle of the division of labor, which first made good guardians a necessity, comes to naught. A sophisticated model state, beyond the early agrarian utopia of the first state, would become an impossibility as well. And if a sophisticated model state comes to naught, then so does our ambition to find justice as a natural dimension of that model state. And if we can't find justice as a natural dimension of a well-built society, then our hopes to transfer our findings about this natural dimension from society to the case of the individual would be dashed as well. And so would accordingly be our hopes to show that individual justice is ultimately natural and not conventional. And if all these things come to naught, then Glaucon and Adeimantus' conventional and ultimately Thrasymachus' cynical account of justice would win the day. Socrates would be defeated, and the whole architecture of the early part of the Republic would fall apart. The possibility of a good guardian, in short, is the linchpin of Socrates' account of justice in the Republic. Here's a linchpin. Without it, the wheels are coming off. Now, fortunately, these worries constitute only a temporary delay in our nation building, because Socrates soon realizes that the seemingly impossible combination of qualities is not only not impossible, but something quite familiar to us. There are natures which combine the qualities we thought incompatible. And, of course, this is where the watchdog analogy now shows its real utility. For have you not observed that it is characteristic of a well-bred dog to behave with the utmost gentleness to those it is used to and knows, but to be savage to strangers? The watchdog is the prime example of an animal that is gentle to its owner but dangerous to others. And that is all that's needed to show that the seemingly impossible combination of qualities is not only not impossible, but actually natural. It is quite a possibility and not at all unnatural, since it is in the nature of these animals to be both gentle and fierce. Now, there's an interesting wrinkle here, because you might wonder if that combination is really so quote-unquote natural after all. Dogs are the result of thousands of years of breeding, and breeding is a highly intentional, conventional, designer type of activity. It starts with nature, but then takes it somewhere else entirely. But that, as it turns out, is no problem either for guard dogs or for guardians. It's one of the reasons why the Republic goes into a lot of detail on the matter of the education of the guardians, which is the topic of the next lecture. Just like good watchdogs are the result of extensive breeding, good guardians require good breeding in the form of an extensive education as well.